This is Liz Davis, and today I'll be talking about jump-starting your design review skills. Now, we are defining design reviews as something when you've worked on a solution or you've started initial thinking about a design or a solution and you are presenting it to a room full of people, whether they're other designers, developers, stakeholders, just throwing up any sort of design, even one page, and how you do that well and how you solicit the right feedback that you are looking for. So first, why guidelines? Why did I pick this, and why did I search for specific guidelines? So to begin this project, I researched what other companies did, like Google and Adobe and InVision and Facebook, and how they kind of structured their design reviews. And they talked about their process, but they didn't necessarily talk about tips for a new designer or designer coming into this situation, about how they can, check these guidelines and make sure that they're following them, or at least have a foundation to set on. And I wanted to make these guidelines to let the designer feel confident when going to their meetings and making sure everything kind of ran smoothly, because design reviews are notorious for being a bit chaotic sometimes. So section 2, my methods. I interviewed 6 designers for this project. They were asked to recall a positive and negative experience in design review, and then I followed up asking if their tactics changed depending on the audience, depending on developers, stakeholders, that sort of thing. And honestly, there wasn't really a big difference aside from speaking to the specific person and their language, and that's actually a guideline itself. So we'll talk about that later. And then at the end, I asked if they had advice on what they would tell a new designer, and kind of put those into the roles as well, or the guidelines as well. My demographics, so I had 4 design consultants and 2 in-house designers. 4 were from Chicago, one was from San Jose, California, and 1 was from Australia. 4 had 10 plus years experience, and 2 with less than 3 years experience. Their titles ranged from UX strategist, UX researcher, UX UI designer, product designer, experience designer, and digital product designer. And lots of different titles for a lot of the same things. So section 3, the guidelines. So I'm going to read them off and then we'll go over them in depth. So first one, split them into 2 sections. When you're asking for feedback as a facilitator, and tips for yourself when you're receiving these feedbacks. So when you're a facilitator asking for feedback, you want to think about sending the designs early, setting expectations and goals, telling a story, show from the user's perspective, and then communicate with your team. Receiving feedback, you should keep in mind that there's no design, quote, well, unquote. Ask questions. Remember, it's not personal, it's just business, and don't try to solve immediately. So back to facilitating, or we're going to start with asking for feedback. These guides will help you when you're in the role of facilitator. So to set the stage, you're going into a meeting and you're bringing your designs in. How do you get the feedback you want instead of just, I hate how that looks? You need constructive feedback in order to solve the problem better. So the first thing you can do is you can send your designs early. You can send them so that your team is not just looking at them for the first time with you. That can save time. They shoot less off the cuff. They can come in with more informed questions. If this isn't possible, like maybe you're designing right up to the wire, which totally happens, you can give a short meeting for quiet reviews. You can put them up there and say, hey, let's take a minute, let's review these designs, and then gives them time to generate their own questions. Second, you want to set the expectations and goals. You can set rules about what feedback you want or don't want. You can outline what has changed since the last review and say, hey, we're not going to go back to that other stuff. We want to talk about this stuff specifically. You can set aside a space for open discussion or comments that were outside the meeting goals. Personally, a lot of the designers I interview do that with InVision or other types of products that allow you to comment on screens, which is super helpful. You can ask for feedback to be framed as problems to solve, not just aesthetics. The number one quote was, that button is blue, I would like it red. And then you ask the person, well, what user problem does that solve? And if they can't give you an answer, then that might just be their opinion instead of an actual constructive feedback. And you can set the stage for how the discussion goes, and you must be willing to reel the discussion back to the goals. So if people get off on a tangent, either you or someone you've designated as facilitator needs to bring them back in. The next one is telling a story. User flows are stories about the user journeys, and your screen should be somewhat of a user flow. Use that when trying to communicate why the design was made or the decision was made, and then always advocate for user validation. Designs are just assumptions until they are validated. Arming yourself with user validation can cut down on opinion battling. Speak their language. If you're talking with a developer, remember, you all have the same goals. You want it to work well, you want it to look good, you want it to be feasible, you don't want to design them such a complicated design that the coding it is just a nightmare. You work together and listen a lot. Listen. You know, for stakeholders, I had a lot of people who say they talk in a business sense. They frame how the design creates value for the user and the business and how that translates into dollars or whatever type of measurement that they would like to hear about. So the next section would be receiving feedback. Taking feedback can be rough sometimes, especially if it's just opinionated, but remembering these designs will help, or these guidelines will help you get through this trying time. First, there's no design well. I had a lot of feedback about this, that they don't necessarily worry about how well they design, but how well they solve the user's problem. And that's a really good way to phrase it. And remember, you won't get kicked out of the room for a bad design. You'll get kicked out for not receiving good feedback. You'll get kicked out for not working together. You'll get kicked out for reacting negatively to some feedback that they give you. You know, I had one story that came up where they talked about how, you know, someone said his design was a joke, and instead of reacting negatively, he was like, well, what's the joke? And they talked through it and were able to solve it, and he got a lot of points for that, he said. You want to ask questions? You'll be in a room full of people with different types of knowledge about the system, the users, and design. Leverage this time to ask questions, and asking the right questions can save lots of time. You want to be open. To remember it's not personal. They said they expect, well, the interviewees expected their first design to come with a ton of changes, and they consider it a wonderful thing. What was the quote? Battle plans never survive first contact with the enemy. And remember, get it user validated. And this was a big one too. Don't try to solve immediately. As designers, we fall into the trap of solutioning before thinking the problem through. Many designers I spoke with talked about how they are still trying to do this less within meetings. Everyone gets excited when they hear a problem. They're like, oh, I know how to solve that. But that can put you in a weird spot, especially if there's really important stakeholders there. You don't want to promise too much or too little. You really should just take it down and be like, hey, you know what? That's a great idea. Or, you know, I did something like this before. Maybe we could do it this way. You know, just take a deep breath and try not to solutionize, which is, trust me, very hard. And in conclusion, these are my guidelines and the future work and limitations of my study. Small sample size, I only interviewed 6, and half were from a company that I worked within. And so they all kind of had very similar theories about how design review should work. I was lucky to get an international person, but that doesn't mean, and the ideas were very similar, but still I would love to interview more people from different types of places. And then user testing. If I had more time, I'd love to test these guidelines out in the wild and refine them more, especially for new designers or, you know, those old designers as well. And that's it for my presentation. Thanks for listening. Have a great summer, and say hello to Hagrid, my dog. Thanks. Bye.